Greetings, friends. I've mentioned Ricardo Duchesne before. I've mentioned his book. I did finish reading it. Canada in Decay, Mass Immigration, Diversity, and the Ethnocide of Euro-Canadians. Ricardo Duchesne is a professor at the University of New Brunswick, one of the rare parts of Canada which is still fairly white. Maybe that's given him a unique perspective. And he's an immigrant himself. He's a white heritage more or less. But anyway, so his perspective is invaluable. He's the sort of guy that should be getting into the news, not Jordan Peterson, who's very safe. Ricardo Duchesne is not willing to go into the MGTOW, but he's willing to go into the alt-right and all that. So that's pretty cool. But the point is, it's a good book. It's very well researched. It's full of facts and statistical information, and that's what I'm going to try and share with you here. Hopefully this video won't go too long. It'll probably be more than 20 minutes. But come back to it if you want. First I'm going to lay some groundwork, and then we're going to get into the statistical facts. And I rearranged it. Most of the stuff I'm presenting to you is from his first two chapters, where he talks about the history of Quebec, or Lower Canada, and then he talks about Upper Canada or Ontario, the history of the immigrant, what you could call immigration. As we'll see, there's a use of language there between settlers or pioneers versus immigrants. We'll get into that, and I want to say a quick word about natives or aboriginals, just from my own knowledge, having read various history books. And of course, you will see throughout this video that Canada was essentially created and sustained by whites, primarily from the British Isles and then later from Europe, but they were all whites up to about 1971, when the situation changed. I won't be getting into after 1971 because that's too much. So it was white pioneers, settlers, later what we could call immigrants in the really not until the 20th century, but we'll understand more about that. So Ricardo Duchesne's book can be purchased on Amazon. I'm heavily indebted to him for this video. I hope he doesn't get annoyed if he sees this, that I'm taking his statistical analysis. But again, this book is valuable not just for any Canadian, but for really anyone who lives in a Western nation who wants to understand the phenomenon of multiculturalism and understand what's going on to their country, and more importantly, what this book provides you with is all the ammunition and all the perspective you need to easily refute the left, but also the globalist left, but also the globalist right, because it's not just the left; it's both ends of the spectrum there that have become participating in encouraging mass immigration to continue and even increase the numbers. There's talk of having Canada with a population of 100 million people at the end of the century, purely from immigration. So just a quick word on the native peoples of Canada. I feel like that's very cliche to start off. Well, there were, everyone wants to start off with the natives, but I feel like, I've worked in historical museums, and that's kind of my thinking here. And because I don't want to deny that they existed. They did exist here, although there were glaciers not that long ago, 11,000 years ago. No one existed here at all because there was over a mile of ice over our head. So the native peoples came probably around 7,500 years ago, give or take 1,000 years. By that time, the ice would have melted, and they were nomadic peoples. They hunted and gathered. And yes, some native North Americans had agriculture, maize, squash, corn. It didn't grow too well in what's now Canada, so maybe farther south. Some of the Hurons, they did have corn, that's true, but it was primitive agriculture. It was not intensive at all. They could not really ever provide their main food source. Yeah, eating corn all the time, that's not good for any race. Your teeth are gonna fall out. It's not good for you. So they were here, but there was nothing that you could call Canada. There would be no sense in using the word Canada because there was no nation state existing. There were nations, blood groups, racial groups of indigenous peoples. They formed a multiplicity of different tribes, which were connected with the United States and would have seen themselves as more of an extension of the U.S. Some of them migrated very far to pursue game during the different seasons of the year. They were essentially primitive. That's not inaccurate to describe these peoples as primitive, because overall European civilization was superior to them. They couldn't help but just wipe them out, and it wasn't directly by genocide. It was by germs and diseases, because the natives didn't have any not indigenous, domestic animals. Not that it's so great to live next to domestic animals, but the Europeans had the germs that they got from the animals, and they had developed resistance over centuries, but then naturally spread those to native peoples who came in contact with them, like influenza, other things. Some native diseases went to Europe, but mostly it was the other way around. And so there were only small numbers of Mississauga natives in this part of the Golden Horseshoe, Lake Ontario, maybe 1,700 by the 1790s, before British settlement really picked up here. And that's it. And they were nomadic, and there would have been a few villages, temporary villages on the Humber River. I've filmed that river before sometimes. But just small groups of people, because there was nothing intensive. Their technology was so low that they just had to get guns from the Europeans, metal pots, knives. They had clay ceramics for cooking, but nothing that would be more sturdier. So they were tied into European trading right from the beginning, and also getting hooked to the alcohol. And basically, Samuel de Champlain gives us a good perspective in a book I was reading recently about the 17th century. And he came into what became New France or Quebec, and I'll talk more about that. I think this is going to be a long video. I'm just letting you know. You'll probably see that by the length anyway, but I don't know how long this is going to go, but it's going to go long, you can tell. But anyways, because it's history, it keeps on going. But Samuel de Champlain came in, and he founded Quebec City, or it was not a city, it was a town, back in 1608. But in the early 17th century, he's like, he was a real pioneer for France. Not a pioneer, but an explorer and a trader, and forming trading relationships with the Huron peoples. And so once he got to know the Hurons, and they were fighting with the Mohawks and the Iroquois, who were one of the Iroquois, because the Mohawks were one of the Iroquois peoples. There were 6 nations in the Iroquois Confederacy. So there was an Iroquois Confederacy. Some historians might like to idealize native peoples. Maybe the Iroquois Confederacy more or less got along with itself, but they certainly constantly fought their neighbors. So this was common to North American Indians for thousands of years, as far as we know. They'd be normally fighting their adversaries, around them. The tribes around them was a constant state of warfare. There was nothing like a king or any rule of law. It was basically the rule of the strong, very Darwinian. And so the Hurons would actually be raiding the Mohawks and killing some of them, but purposely taking young male prisoners to incorporate them into their own culture, because there was a lack of young males, because they were getting killed off in warfare all the time. So there was this constant need to resupply young males. And then he accompanied the Hurons and with his arquebus, and was able to turn the tide of one battle against the Mohawks deep in Mohawk territory. And but they sacrificed one of the prisoners all the prisoners that they were taking. I don't know, let's say 15 or 20 young men. They slashed their tendons in their ankles so they couldn't get away during a long journey home, because they're on the other side of the lake. There'd be north around what's now around Kingston, or I could be wrong. So if you know more about history of where they were at, where these Hurons were actually based, it's kind of hard to say, because they're kind of just all in that area there. Who knows exactly where? But much farther north of Lake Champlain. So it's a long journey home, and they have their ankles slashed so they can't get away. And then one of them was sacrificed, but before he was killed, he was tortured for hours. They were burning him with embers. And I know I'm giving you a sensational story here, but I really don't think this is too out of the ordinary. From what I've heard, there was a brutal aspect to many of these tribes, and they'd be disemboweling him, they'd be pulling his intestines out, and they were telling the guy, like, you have to stay strong to be a worthy sacrificial victim, because when we eat your heart, it has to be a worthy heart to eat. So you got to be a man. You got to die like a man. And they're doing this to supposedly their enemy. I guess because they were similar cultures. And Champlain's like, this is crazy. In Europe, we just hang a man. We just cut his head off. What the hell are you guys doing? Let me get my arquebus and just finish him off. And because he was actually feeling sorry for this guy, and so Champlain had to shoot this guy and make this poor kid, get him to die. But then he was cannibalized. The Hurons ate him. So I know I'm going off here, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of an anthropological account. I did study anthropology. But anyway, so you have your anthropology there. But this was a brutal world. No rule of law. There you have it. So that's the kind of world that the French settlers are coming into. And I have to, the history of Canada is the history of Quebec or New France up to 1763, because before then 1763 was the conquest, when the English conquered Quebec and the British Empire absorbed what was New France at that time. But there wasn't too much Anglo or British settlement in what is now Quebec or Ontario. Before 1763, there wasn't. There were the English settlements along the seaboard of the United States, which later rebelled. So that's why the history of Canada, you have to cover the French. They are basically our history, even though I'm not from a French background. I'll talk more about my background at the very end. So New France, just a quick word there on the difference between New France and Quebec, because there's a slight difference there. New France grew over several centuries, beginning from the exploring efforts of Jacques Cartier in the 1530s, exploring Newfoundland and the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and expanding with trading posts. And it was like basically the French crown came to lay claim to an immense territory of North America. Not just, starting on the shores of the bank of the St. Lawrence River at Quebec, founded in 1608 by Champlain, and later and then Montreal further upriver, and then further into the Great Lakes, and then that takes you pretty much all the Great Lakes, and then into the interior of North America, into the Mississippi watershed, and all the way down through the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. The French had all this domain under their control, but not really with really many soldiers, just some trading outposts and trading for furs with the native peoples. But they did have settlements. It's not like they didn't have anyone there. And there's parts of the southern states today that are descended from French settlers there. So it was an immense territory, never populated so much. But Quebec, I'm calling it Quebec because you could use that interchangeably with Lower Canada. That was a bit more populated than the rest of New France. So when I say, I'm not trying to say New France anymore, I'll just say Lower Canada or Quebec, because it was downriver from Lake Ontario. It was closer to the ocean, hence Lower Canada. Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, you'd go upriver. It's higher altitude. Actually, Toronto is precisely 65 meters above sea level. I looked it up once, and I remembered statistics. Although there's a lot of statistics I'll be giving you here, which obviously I'm going to have to read. You see everything up to now, I'm just speaking off the top of my head. I made a few notes here, but later if you see my eyes going down, it's because, yes, I'm reading things which I have organized here. So again, we got to clarify the difference between immigrant, settler, or pioneer, because this is something that the establishment constantly tries to tell us, that Canada is a land of diverse immigrants. It was everyone who came here, by definition, came from another country, and therefore they are an immigrant. But this is a corruption of the word, and it's true that some dictionaries are now getting politically correct now, and they're changing the definition of immigrant. But actually, immigrant should mean a person who moves from one country to a foreign country. In other words, a country which is already established. They move to a foreign country, not a wilderness, not a new land, not a land where there are only a few inhabitants, like in the case of the early settlers and pioneers here in North America. No, they're moving to established infrastructure. So we think of the Europes trying to get, the migrants trying to get into Europe right now. Good example of, well, they're not technically immigrants because they're doing it illegally, but some of them are doing it legally, unfortunately. That's an example of people who are coming into an already established society. There's already towns and welfare for them to take advantage of. Not that all immigrants historically took advantage of welfare, but there's a difference there. Maybe it's a spectrum, maybe it's a gray line, but clearly there is something different, because these pioneers are the first people to make the roads, to build the log cabins, to seed the land, to work, and all. I mean, in the case of Quebec, as we'll see, they had to put up with the raids from the Iroquois, and they could get scalped for that. And in the early 17th century, throughout the 17th century, lack of food, starvation, all these things that, an immigrant really isn't going to go to a country like that it's a bit of a different, it's a different idea. These were pioneers, and then settlers. It's similar to pioneer, but you would think more of the people coming later on in the 19th century. Well, not later on, but between 1815 to 1830, 1850, and then maybe some people would push it again to the, well, quite fairly, as Duchesne does. He says even up until 1921 or before, at least up to the First World War, everyone who came here was really not an immigrant. They were settlers mostly, because they were especially settling the West. So there had been some roads built, but basically, no, you have to start the farm, you have to build your own house. You're a settler, you're the first people there. But we'll talk more about that in a bit. So don't pay any attention to this nonsense about all Canadians or all Americans or all whatever for that, or all Australians for that reason, all being immigrants. No, it's quite a different story here. So okay, so now we can finally get into these facts. I'm going to talk about Quebec's population growth and their immigration history because, of course, this is the history of Canada up to 1763. So by 1645, a few decades after the founding of Quebec, the population of the colony was still only 400 people. By 1660, it had grown to 3,215, of approximately 1,250 were Canadian born. And then immigration to the new colony at Quebec peaked at a total of 1,698 during the 1660s, during that decade. And by 1672, the population was now 6,700, so still fairly low a few centuries ago. And then immigration to Quebec declined to an average of 500 per decade up to the decade of the 1750s. And at that time, it raised up a bit to about 1,700. But because of natural increase, Quebec's population was 70,000 people at the time of the English conquest in 1763. There were only 10,000 immigrants to Quebec from the years 1608 all the way up to 1763, just 10,000 immigrants. So you can see if the population was 70,000 and they only had 10,000 immigrants, you can see the effect of all that natural increase of women having babies. So after the conquest of Quebec, there was literally no immigration, virtually non-existent immigration to Quebec following the conquest. Of course, not until later on, until the 20th century. And by 1851, Quebec's population was 890,000 people. This was almost all from natural increase. And from the 1660s through the 1800s, Quebecois women had an average of 5.6 children per woman. And so by 1950, Quebec's population was almost 4 million. It would have been practically all white Francophones, all natural, born in the, Duchesne, he keeps saying a lot like, born in the soil of Canada. So, okay, now let's examine Upper Canada's population growth and immigration, and also that for Canada as a whole. So that we start with the Loyalists. The Loyalists were internal migrants. They were not immigrants. They moved from colonies that were British, because the United States was British, even if it was Scottish origin or Celtic or Irish. They were British culture, British genetics, right? So it was only recently separated from the home country, anyways. And they were, of course, a movement from one region of British North America to another region of British North America, one that wasn't really had too many people living in it at that time. And the French hadn't really settled much in Upper Canada, just some trading outposts. There were no towns. And of course, I talked about the relatively few native people living there. And a total of 50,000, by the way, the Loyalists, they were loyal to the British Crown, to King George, because maybe some Americans might not like this, but your American Revolution, it was also a civil war. So, and I mean, lots of people didn't agree with it. So, not that I think it was a good idea. I think, you don't have, you don't get taxed without, I mean, not that you were taxed very much. The English were taxed 25 times in the home country more than what you were taxed in the 1770s. However, on the principle of not having representation and then the Crown being able to make laws for you, yeah, of course, you had justification to rebel, absolutely. But it was a civil war, so you had these Loyalists that wanted to stay part of British North America because there was still plenty of North America that remained British. So they went to Upper Canada, and I mentioned a total of 50,000 came during the 1780s and the 1790s. And of that total, 14,000 went to Upper Canada and Lower Canada, although most of those went to Upper Canada, which is Ontario today. Because, Lower Canada was already French. So there are some English speakers in Quebec today, but it was a smaller initial settlement. But an equally large number, 14,500 of the Loyalists, of that 50,000 figure, they went to New Brunswick. And the same number, another 14,500, went to Nova Scotia. So at the time in history, it wouldn't have seemed like, oh, Ontario's going to be the big golden horseshoe and Toronto's going to be this big city. It's going to be driving the economy. It's like, no, go to Nova Scotia or New Brunswick today, which are very sparsely populated compared to Ontario. So it would have been a very different world back then. But still, very homogeneous in terms of the origin, and mostly these were of Scotch or Irish origin. But that's all from the British Isles, but maybe 30% English. So taking into account natural increase, Canada's Loyalist population is said to have been about 60,000 by the year 1811. There were about 3,000 African slaves and 2,000 Aboriginals, which accompanied the Loyalist migration to Upper Canada. But in the 1780s and 1790s, the total non-white population of Upper Canada was only 7%. So it's silly to think of these African slaves or Aboriginals as Loyalists, because they didn't really have that allegiance to the crown. They weren't part of the culture. Loyalists were specifically whites who remained loyal to the British crown. And I should say that there were a lot of these late Loyalists. That's true. I know that from working at Fort York and my history, knowing about the War of 1812. And sure, a lot of Americans basically came into Upper Canada and they wanted the land. You get the land, so you sign an oath of allegiance to King George. Now you're a British subject. But the point is, pretty close culture, pretty close genetic heritage. It doesn't really matter. It's like easy to assimilate to that culture. But yes, there were a lot of late Loyalists. But the initial movement, they were very proud. And that's what's important, having that proud culture at the beginning. So even if you weren't descended from real Loyalists that fervently believed in it, your children might come to get swept up in that. And as we'll see later on, there was even more migration or arrivals coming from the British Isles. This was just the beginning. So before Confederation, most immigrants from the British Isles were Irish, a total of 850,000. Before Confederation was in 1867. That's when Canada became its own country without a war. Just said, hey, Britain, we're going to have our own country now, and they let us do it, and so you're going to have your own responsible government. And so 850,000 Irish compared to only 300,000 English, which had come before 1867. So you might think, well, Canada was certainly more Celtic, Scotch, Irish, and probably it is today. Probably it is. I don't know. I didn't look this up. Probably around 2/3 genetic heritage of whites. I mean, and obviously it's changed now, but they were from Scotland or Ireland. However, during 1900 to 1930, English immigrants totaled 1.6 million. So there was a kind of a change in the British Empire. There were a lot of English going out to the far-flung corners of the empire at that time, and this surpassed Irish arrivals, which were only 175,000 from 1900 to 1930. So, but however, if you think this is later in Canada's history now, so those are initial Celtic immigrants or immigrants, there's that word again, but I'm using it. The arrivals are initially would have been already now having their natural increase. They would have already been having more generations. So if you get into the game later, you're going to have less of an effect demographically later on. And the English weren't known for having such great numbers of kids, certainly more than we'd have today, but not compared to the French. At least the French, they bred like rabbits, as we know, 5.6 average for the Quebecois women for almost 200 years. And of course, most of the original Loyalists were from Scotland and Ireland, but all the immigrants before Confederation were mostly English speaking, although that's not technically true. Some of them spoke Gaelic as a first language, but they were easily assimilated into Anglo culture and learned English. And by the way, not to pay no attention to the Maritimes, but Nova Scotia also saw the arrival of 1,500 German Protestants beginning in the 1750s. So from 1815 to 1867, Canada's population grew from 600,000 to over 3.5 million. And during this time, the country received about 1 million immigrants. So I am taking this from Mr. Duchesne's book here, I acknowledge. This is right out of his book. And however, during that time, when all those immigrants came in, Canada just became more anglicized. Certainly got whiter, but it got more Anglo because more people are now coming from the British Isles, whereas inside Quebec, there was really no immigration, so it sort of stayed the same. It had no impact on Quebec. So by 1867, the population of Canada was about 60% of British blood, 30% of French blood, and another 7% of European whites and immigrant whites from the United States, many of whom were Canadians who had gone over there and then come back some years later. Whereas the number of African slaves in Lower Canada in 1867, or pardon me, between 1681 all the way up to 1818, so that's a bit further back in the history, African slaves were less than 1% of the population. Now, I mentioned it's true that many of the Irish and Scottish immigrants spoke Gaelic language, but they were able to assimilate. The genetic makeup of the British Isles has hardly changed in the last 1400 years, as Mr. Duchesne tells us, because as I know, as is basic common knowledge, the ancestral peoples of the British Isles were mostly a lot of Celtic blood mixed in with Anglo-Saxons, and then a dash of Viking blood, because there was the Danewald. Was that what it was called? The Danewald, and like King Alfred, he had to hold on to England, and there was like a border between England. And because the Vikings, sometimes you just had to work with them, and sometimes they came to stay and they never left, but then they breed with you later on, just like the Normans. They came, they conquered, but then the Normans' homeland got conquered, and eventually the Normans began breeding with the English all around them, and English became the #1 language again, not French. So after, from 1815, when Napoleon's defeated, up to 1867, thousands of Germans also arrived in Canada. By 1871, 203,000 persons were listed as German, which is 6% of the population. Meanwhile, the combined number of blacks, Aboriginals, and Asians amounted to less than 2%, which was declining in its relative proportion. So after this Anglo invasion from the British Isles from 1815 up to 1850, there was relatively low numbers of immigration coming into Canada. And then from 1867 to up to 1896, the federal government was actually trying to intentionally get people to come to Canada, to settle here, to ensure that the prairies were settled and that they would have sovereignty and not lose it to the United States. But they were unsuccessful. They weren't able to really get too many people to come. So to give us some perspective here, by 1861, Canada's overall population was 3.1 million. By 1876, it was 4 million. And then by 1891, it had increased to 4.8 million. And then from 1896 to 1921, about 2.5 million immigrants arrived in Canada. And these, some historians have said 3 million, but according to Mr. Duchesne, it's actually closer to 2.5 million. And so Canada's population increased from 5 million to 7.8 million by 1914, pardon me. So these arrivals did increase Canada's diversity, but it was, in terms of not French or not British origin, but these were all whites from Europe. So the white homogeneity, basically, it even increased. Canada, in a way, it even became more white, up to a maximum of about 97.5% of white European origin in about 1921. So during 1896 to 1914, 1914 because that's when World War I started, and during that time, 1.25 million immigrants came from the British Isles, about 750,000 from the U.S., and I mentioned that most of them were former Canadians, and then about 500,000 immigrants from continental Europe. So 21,500 blacks, they came back in 1871, but after 1871, black arrivals declined. From 1901 to 1911, less than 1,500 blacks came to Canada. So that's interesting. Over a 10-year period, less than 1,500 people came in. And then after 1911, there were actually immigration restrictions in Canada increasingly, and hardly any blacks came here until the 1960s. And the Asian population in Canada was at its climax in the early 1900s. But then it was stopped entirely by the imposition of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923. And likewise, immigrants from India were prohibited completely after 1907. And so to give you an idea, in 1931, there were a total of 46,000 Chinese people in China. That would have been the largest Asian ethnicity at the time. So as for the Aboriginals, they made up about 1% of Canada's population at Confederation, and they declined further in absolute numbers until the early 20th century. About 3.5 million immigrants arrived between 1946 and 1972, but they were all white. And let me add something, let me interject here. I know I'm basically giving you Duchesne's facts here. For Canadian white women had achieved the vote for the first time in the 1921 federal elections. And then by 1960, women of all other races in Canada had also been granted the vote. So only after 1971 did Canada begin accepting non-white immigrants. This is getting back to the book now. So only after 1971 did we get into our current multicultural spiral of mass immigration. And I think there were many blunders that led to this happening. No time to discuss them in this video. This video has gone on long enough. Maybe another video. But for what it's worth, I think giving women the vote was like removing a sturdy foundation brick from, that was underlying Canadian culture. Though, of course, many other bricks had probably been removed long before this came to pass. And just at the very end, my own ethnic background, I am based, I have an English first name, English last name, because on my father's side. And so his family would have come to Toronto, which was then York, in the 1830s. But he was actually, so basically that makes him Canadian, right? But with an English background. But then his dad was from that English background, but his mother was Irish. So he's actually half Irish, half English background, but Canadian background. But you know how it is. And then on my mother's side, Latvian. So I'm 50% Latvian. You may have met my grandfather, so he's Latvian. My mother was born in what part of England? She was born in England in 1958. But then they immigrated. You can use the term immigrated then, for sure, by the 1960s, an immigrant. And they came to Montreal. So she grew up in Montreal. I grew up in Toronto. I was born in Toronto. So Toronto's my hometown. And there you have it. So 50% Latvian and 25% English, the other part Irish. By the way, I was going to mention one other thing. I forgot to mention this in the beginning. This is kind of random, but the native peoples, one advantage they did have over the Europeans was the Europeans regarded a lot of stuff as superstition, which rightly was superstition, but they thought that the shamans were just doing nonsense. Maybe they were, but actually the shamans, they have psychic abilities. Okay, the native peoples have psychic abilities. Apparently so do Irish Celtic peoples. They also have a psychic heritage. That's one thing that was lost. Because these native peoples, they would consult their shamans. The shamans would smoke a lot of tobacco, go into trance, and they would be able to locate enemy tribes, ascertain their size, ascertain whether it's a good idea to fight today. So, anyways, that was kind of a random thought to finish with. Hasta luego, amigos.